that are ongoing in Iraq. But that isn't the only country that's dealing with violent demonstrations, dealing with rioting, and overall government chaos. If you take a look at the map here, in Hong Kong, demonstrations have stretched into the 6th month there, with now face masks being banned as authorities try to clamp down on the anti-government and anti-China rallies. And in France, the Yellow Vest movement continues now in its 46th week, with marches ongoing in Paris and other parts of the country. But this week, police also joined the protest, with thousands of French police officers marching against low wages, long hours, and increasing suicide rates in their ranks. And across the globe, in Haiti, violent clashes between demonstrators and police over government corruption and calls for the resignation of the island's president continue to tear the island apart. Going down to South America, Ecuador's government has declared a state of emergency as anti-government demonstrations continue to grow, with hundreds of people already arrested. And just south, in Peru, the country's beleaguered government remains in a state of chaos, with the president and opposition-backed Congress wrestling and grappling for power. Return now to the situation in Iraq, and the eruption of protests and ensuing crackdown has raised concerns about further instability in a key oil-producing country in the Middle East. That's, of course, of interest to the United States and U.S. companies and U.S. investors and investments in Iraq, and it's also of interest to China. China has increased its investments in Iraq, surpassing $30 billion in 2018. China is considered the biggest trading partner of Iraq, and Iraq is the second biggest oil supplier to China. China has invested in international roads, highways, and railway projects in Iraq, along with a $1 billion deal to build hospitals, homes, and schools across southern Iraq. So it's clear China is in Iraq to stay. With more on this and the protests and what to expect, let's bring in our guests now. We got Bubba Horwitz, CEO of Bubba Trading, and Michael Maloof, former Pentagon official. Bubba, let's start with you and Iraq's oil interests. My question is really, who at this point controls the oil in the country?
The corrupt government controls on the country right now. That's why you're seeing the people rise up. This is almost identical to what happened in Venezuela. I mean, eventually the people rise up when they know that they have a wealthy commodity that is bringing in nothing but money, yet they're living without water, without toilets, without electricity. So again, it's held by the corrupt government. That's who holds the oil there.
And how much you heard me talking about China? Of course, the United States has always had an interest, but China is playing a significant role at this point now too, right?
Well, yeah, because listen, China, like the United States, they're looking for alternatives to go to, and of course, they believe, based on their regime, that they can actually almost take control of Iran by building and putting all this stuff together, so they can actually have, I think, a controlling interest in the country. And I think, again, this goes back to when you get to the top and you're with all the oligarchs and all the billionaires, they don't care about the people below them, and if they can get something going, they're going to take advantage of it. I think that's what you're seeing with China going going there.
What at this point, what are the U.S. interests? U.S. continues to have companies there. What are some of the main companies that remain in Iraq, and what is the U.S. interest at this point and continuing interest?
Well, again, I think that we have slowly, obviously, moving away from Iraq. I mean, again, if Iraq does something like they did in the Strait of Hormuz, or something happens, and it does create a little fear in oil. We saw what happened with Saudi Arabia; it creates a little fear. But at the end of the day, you can see now that oil is come all the way back, and actually is lower than before the bombing, or the supposed drone bombing in Saudi Arabia from Iran. From Iraq, and of course we are a net exporter of oil, and we've just approved, and President Trump has approved to put more oil. So basically, we can have very little to do with Iran. We are no longer under the OPEC regime control and that entire environment anymore.
Michael, let me turn to you. We led the show with the ongoing protests, the demands for change. We talked about this before the program. What would change look like? I mean, what's the end game here with these protests? Obviously, the protesters are talking about, government corruption. They want a change in the government. But doesn't that open it up to a catastrophic situation, as history has shown in Iraq?
If it's not changed, it certainly will. And I think the people are fed up. As Bubba points out, the government controls the cash and the money and the flow. They've got the oil reserves and cash. They haven't reinvested into the economy, and basic services are nil, and as a consequence, they're rising up as a result. It's predominantly Shia right now, but I'm really concerned about this getting out of hand, which could then introduce new elements into this area, namely Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which are in neighboring provinces.
Yeah, and that remains a concern, is the potential for something catastrophic occurring, because when there's no power, when there's no government, when there's that opens it up to anybody.
Oh yeah, well you're seeing also, as you pointed out with China, that's part of their overall scheme, long-term scheme for the Belt Road Initiative, and it's very intriguing that they have made that kind of investment. So they do have a major investment, which would include Iran. They want Iraq in there, and this is part of their long-term strategy.
And it's not only Iraq, Iran, but China's invested in Israel.
Of course.
The Haifa port, which is of concern to the United States. China's looking at investments in Lebanon. China's looking at investments in Africa as well.
Well, it's not only Africa, but also Latin America. They basically have told the United States, we don't care about your sanctions. We don't care about any tariffs. They just signed that $480 billion deal with Iran for oil and infrastructure development. So China has a major invested interest in that entire region, and particularly in Iraq as well. But to get back to the strategic threat here, we have the leadership of the Shia right now pleading with the people and the government, principally the government, to listen to the demands of the people in order to avoid the catastrophic prediction that you mentioned, and it could get out of hand very, very rapidly.
Absolutely. Well, we'll continue to follow this. Michael Malou.